Welcome back to another episode of the Most Dangerous Podcast Players. Continuing our season of the Warren Files, we wanted to start with a quick recap. The hauntings from both the Perrin family case and the Annabelle case we found to be completely true. Moving on to our next case, we take on the Conjuring 2, which is based on the Enfield haunting. There is so much controversy embedded within this case, and we can't wait to share all the details we found with you. Buckle up, players, because we're heading off to Enfield, London, England.
As we always like to do with our episodes, we want to give all of our players a little background on the family and the case itself. The Warrens, whose cases have typically taken place in the New England area, are now overseas in England. Enfield is a small, suburbial, somewhat poor area in the London area. 284 Green Street houses the Hodgson family, which consists of divorced single mother Peggy, Margaret, Janet, John, and Billy. Peggy worked hard for her family. Being a single parent, you kinda have to, and people in the neighborhood recognized that in her. Margaret was more serious and reserved, Janet lively and extroverted, and Billy had a severe speech impediment, but regardless, lived his life out like any typical boy. And John went to a special boarding school and was only home during the holidays, and sometimes on weekends, meaning he wasn't really around. Peggy and her family had great relationships with their neighbors across the way, Vic Nottingham, Peggy, not Peggy Hodgson, and their son Gary. Along with the Nottinghams, Peggy Hodgson's brother, John Burcombe, lived nearby with his wife Sylvia and their two children, Paul and Denise. In August of 1977, strange things began to happen in the Hodgson home, which would span an absolute circus in their home for the next 2 years.
Janet is the main source of information in this case, as she is the one who was the most affected by the hauntings. She claims to remember one night sitting up in her bed and seeing the dresser slide across her room that she shared with her brother. From there, the activity increased to hearing strange noises that were completely unexplainable. Even their neighbor Vic, who went over after the family terrifyingly ran into their home to investigate, said he couldn't figure out what those noises were. There were knocking sounds coming from the walls, the bedroom, and even on the ceiling. He claims to have felt completely frightened while checking things out. The noises were completely unexplainable to the point where Peggy Hodgson thought there might be burglars or drifters hiding out in the walls somewhere, so she called the police. The police officer who arrived had the fright of his life after seeing a chair move across the floor completely on its own. Things only began to get worse from there.
As the hauntings continued, Legos and marbles were reportedly flying around the room, hot when you picked them up. Clothing and tabletops would also fly across the room. The sound of dogs barking would be heard in empty rooms. Lights would flicker, coins would drop out of thin air, and furniture would spin or tip over without being touched or having anyone around it. The final straw, though, was an iron fireplace being ripped out of the wall in the upstairs bedroom. From there, paranormal investigators from all over the world wanted to come to the home, claiming they could help or even contact the spirits, wanting to know more about this Enfield haunting. In this case, the press is a huge issue and was greatly involved throughout the 2 years this haunting took place. The press would come to the home and report back chaos, things flying around the room, and there are pictures to go with it. The most concerning pictures are those of Janet being thrown across the room, or her face even being distorted in pain. A lot of the reporters and press that came to the Enfield home believed that the children were faking the entire thing for attention, as one of the kids claimed to have done so one time, but stating that the other experiences were 100% true. It was no shock then to see the Warrens fly on over to jolly old England to take a look at the house and the Hodgson's case.
When the Warrens came to the Enfield house, they immediately jumped straight to a demonic presence that was later overlooked as the skeptics stated that Ed made things up regarding the haunting. Whatever the case on that, though, the most important thing to note is that the Warrens were actually not that involved in the Enfield home like the Conjuring 2 film portrays them to be. The Warrens did briefly investigate the home in the summer of 1978, and, as previously stated, were just two of the many, many paranormal investigators who looked at the home. In fact, the majority of articles about the Enfield haunting rarely even mention the Warrens' involvement. That's how little of an effect they had on the case. Guy Lyon Playfair, who was one of the original investigators on the case, has stated that the Warrens showed up uninvited and really only stayed for about a day, and that Ed claims to have told him he could make a lot of money off of the case. Strange. You wouldn't think Ed Warren would be talking about gaining money from helping people based on the character we've been exposed to in the films and based off of interviews, but we digress. Ed Warren did touch on the case to help the skeptics out with their disbelief by stating, "Inhuman spirit phenomena were in progress. Now, you couldn't record the dangerous, threatening atmosphere inside that little house, but you could film the levitations, teleportations, and dematerialization of people and objects that were happening there, not to mention the many hundreds of hours of tape recordings made of these spirit voices speaking out loud in the rooms." As the media and press went deeper and deeper into the case, they all culminated the same idea. The Enfield haunting was a hoax, and the Warrens were nothing but frauds. Janet claims that it was a priest's 1978 visit that made the hauntings subside slightly. They would still hear noises, feeling like they were being watched, things of that nature, until finally in 1979, the hauntings just simply stopped with no explanation. There was no exorcism done by the Warrens, the family didn't do anything special to stop the hauntings, and no one can explain how or why the hauntings started and eventually stopped.
We were a little bummed to find out that the Warrens didn't have as big of an involvement in the case as the movie seems to suggest, but we still wanted to do our research on the Enfield haunting and present it to our players. So, instead of the Warrens, we will be talking about Maurice Grosse and Guy Playfair, who were the true investigators in this case. Maurice Grosse was a successful inventor and is responsible for many innovations, but is most known for his creation of the rotating advertising billboard. His interest in the paranormal came about after losing his own daughter, coincidentally named Janet, in 1976 after sustaining a head injury in a motorcycle accident. Maurice Grosse was summoned by request from the Society for Physical Research after recently joining the organization and expressing his interest in being an investigator. On September 5th, Grosse visited the home and expressed to Peggy to remain calm and simply take any notes of any incidents. On September 8th, Grosse experienced the house's wrath firsthand, hearing a loud, unexplained crash, and decided to take the case on. During his visits, he noted the following: marbles flying through the air and landing on the floor without rolling, doors and drawers opening on their own, doors chimes that swung, and objects such as teaspoons, boxes, and fish tank lids jumping up into the air. At this point into the investigation, as many as 10 people outside the family themselves had witnessed these events with their own eyes. From this, Grosse realized he was going to need assistance and reached out to the Society for Physical Research to bring someone else in. On September 12th, author and investigator Guy Playfair entered the investigation along with Rosalind Morris from BBC Radio 4. Together, Grosse and Playfair worked with the Hodgson family for more than a year and made a total of 180 visits and 25 overnight stays at the house.
Here's where some of the controversy comes in. In December 1977, just a few months after the paranormal disturbances began, Janet began to emanate a strange, unknown voice, almost like she was possessed. It started out as whistles, dog-like barks, and then eventually it developed into a human voice that resembled an elderly man. The voice was harsh and guttural, and not like Janet's at all. Here is where the horrible part of the story comes to play. It is claimed by Janet herself that she was encouraged by Grosse to talk in this possessed voice, that when discussing the noises they would hear, such as the growls and barking, that it would be amazing if the noises turned into words. To eliminate the idea to the press that Janet was the one doing the voice, he taped her mouth and recorded her. The voice was muffled and subdued, same as when they filled her mouth with water. But in early January 1978, Margaret started to speak in this voice that Janet had previously been heard doing. The team of investigators did everything they could to record these voices, including having a speech therapist confirm that it's unclear as to where the voice was coming from and that it had the resemblance of a false vocal cord tone, which is hardly used when speaking. Mainly heavy metal bands, screamo if you will, tend to use these vocal cords to make their voices deeper and more guttural sounding. A ventriloquist, Ray Allen, suggested that the voice was being produced from the diaphragm, but this was disputed by Gross and Playfair. Gross was so convinced that this voice was paranormal that he offered upwards of £1,000 to a child who could replicate the voice the same way Janet did. No one took him on the offer. He was even more thoroughly convinced when research suggested that this has happened in similar possessions. He called upon John Hasted, a physicist at London's Birkbeck College, to carry out an experiment with his colleague Adrian Forson, a phonetics expert at University College London. They tested Janet with a laryngograph to see if she was able to produce plica ventricularis, where muscle tension in the throat can produce sounds independent of vocal cords. And although Janet did not suffer any of the harsh side effects that comes with this test, they did test her for 6 continuous weeks. 2 experts from the Society for Psychical Research caught the Hodgson children bending spoons themselves, and also found it quite strange that no one was allowed in the room when Janet would talk in the possessed voice. Janet herself has even indicated that some of the paranormal events were completely fabricated just to see if Gross and Playfair would catch on, although she says it's only about 2% of what actually went on that was fabricated. There have been instances where Janet says that the house was not haunted, to which she means that the poltergeist, as said before, is not evil, so therefore she doesn't consider the house haunted. Janet said she felt used by an unknown force, and that the experience is something she doesn't really like to think about. In fact, she didn't find the spirit evil at all, and that it was just trying to be part of the family and communicate through her and her sister Margaret. Although there were many spirits that are rumored to have come through, Bill Wilkins is the main entity to make his presence known.
We did want to give a quick reference to Bill Wilkins and briefly discuss his role in the haunting a little bit. Bill Wilkins' son Terry confirmed that his father did in fact die in the manner of which Janet described, in the armchair downstairs, after suffering a brain hemorrhage. The voice that came from Janet delivered a haunting message that described graphic detail of the moment of his death. The voice, which can still be heard on tapes today. You know what? Let's just have you take a listen.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died. Just before you died and just after you died.
Days before I died, I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
This is supposedly the voice of Bill Wilkins, and the tape you just listened to was taken several years after his death. After the news of Bill talking through Janet escaped the media, his son, Terry, contacted Gross and Playfair to confirm the details.
The aftermath of this whole circus event of a haunting is troublesome, to say the least. Many people cast their doubts on the events that plagued the Hodgson family. There were so many instances where things were caught being fabricated, mixed in with very real, very terrifying events that were witnessed by multiple people with their own eyes. Janet felt traumatized by the events and was not very happy with the film The Conjuring 2, and actually says that she knew nothing about it as she was grieving over the recent loss of her father. We would like to read a quote from an interview with Janet. "It was an extraordinary case. It's one of the most recognized cases of paranormal activity in the world, but for me, it was quite daunting. I think it really left its mark, the activities, the newspaper attention, the different people in and out of the house. It wasn't a normal childhood." Janet underwent so many different tests and trials, including stays at psychiatric facilities where they would find nothing out of the ordinary about her. The situation had a huge effect on the entire family, but especially Janet, as she was the main source of the poltergeist attention. Due to the fact that the media ate this story up for years, Janet was bullied at school. She would come home to the front door wide open and random people going in and out of her house, not knowing what to expect. She even says her mom had a nervous breakdown at the end of the activity that went on in their home. Janet says that she's tried to move on from the whole experience and not live in the past, but at times she'll dream about the experience and seems to never fully get away from the trauma that came from the Enfield haunting. Janet moved out of her home at the age of 16 and got married. She wanted to escape the front page news, the books, and the exploitation experienced by her, and especially her mother. After the circus subsided, Johnny, Janet's younger brother, died of cancer at the young age of 14, and then her mother, Peggy, developed breast cancer and passed away in 2003. To add on to Janet's pain and suffering, her own son died in his sleep when he was only 18. She maintains her stance that everything experienced in the house was real and refuses to suggest or accept that the story was faked for media attention and or money.
Claire Bennett and her 4 sons moved into 284 Green Street shortly after Peggy Hodgson passed, and she says that she hasn't seen anything, but always feels like something is watching her, and that there's a presence in the house. Billy also stated that he continued to feel something watching him, as he stayed at the home to care for his mother until she passed. Claire's sons also claimed to hear voices talking downstairs, and after hearing about the events that happened in the house, she and her sons fled after just 2 months. The night before they left, Shaka, one of her sons, said he woke up to see a man come into his room. He ran to his mother and said, "We need to move," and they did exactly that. The current owners of the home do not wish to be identified, but the matriarch says she knows about the history, but does not want her children to become frightened, and keeps them in the dark.
Take a deep breath, because we have finally reached the end of all of our research. There was a lot to go through and consider, and it's very hard to make these videos sometimes because we're talking about real people and their experiences. Whether we believe them or not, that's something that will always haunt them. It's clear that the Hodgson family was plagued by something, if not by a poltergeist, at least by the media, investigators, researchers, and people of their community. That in and of itself is enough to make us feel haunted. But as for the actual haunting itself, we believe this case to be false. There's just way too much controversy and explainable situations that for the 70s might have been unexplainable, but now in 2020, very explainable. So, where we completely feel for the Hodgson family and wish the living family members only the best in their lives, we do believe this haunting was a hoax. We feel greatly for all of the pain and suffering the family had to endure at the hands of critics, journalists, radio, television, movies, and society, but we just can't see the truth in the haunting.
Now, that was a lot to digest, players. And if you're still with us, thank you so much. We really appreciate all of the support that you guys have been giving us, and we are so glad that you've been enjoying the videos. So next week, we are moving on to a case that actually kind of sparked Caitlin's interest in the paranormal, and believe it to be real. A haunting in Connecticut, also known as the Schnedker family. So stay warmed up, players, because we're only just beginning to open up these files.